Hi Grundo Gazette followers. I'm Billy Tooma and I'm the filmmaker behind Ken Forsse, Come Dream With Me Tonight, the biographical look on the life of the creator of Teddy Ruxpin. I started making films back in 2006. That's when I founded my company, Icon Independent Films, and about 3 years later in 2009 I embarked on my first documentary, Clarence Chamberlain, Fly First and Fight Afterward. That came out in 2011 and it was the beginning of my life in documentary filmmaking. There's something about being able to tell the stories of those who have been kind of marginalized by history or kind of pushed to the side. You see that in the Clarence Chamberlain film. In my second film, Poetry of Witness, which came out in 2015, my co-filmmaker Anthony Cirillo and I looked at 6 different poets of witness who have lived through, and in this case they survived, extremities like war, torture, exile, repression by the state. My third documentary was the 3.5-hour long Black Eagle of Harlem, the life of Hubert Fauntleroy Julian. That was 2017. And a year later, George Washington, the farewell address. We looked at the goodbye of our country's first president, and here we are. I didn't go to film school. I have a bachelor's in English literature and secondary education from William Patterson University. My master's is in English with the concentration in writing, also from William Patterson. My doctorate is a Doctor of Letters degree from Drew University, and that was literary studies. So filmmaking was not something I went to school for. Filmmaking is something that I've always loved and admired. The winter of 2008, 2009, I was home sick on the couch, and I don't even remember what it was. This documentary comes on and I'm watching it and I'm thinking, I could do just as bad or better. I can't do any worse than what I was watching, and that's how it all kind of happened with Clarence Chamberlain. And all of my films you can see for free on YouTube. The channel is my name, Billy Tooma, Icon Independent Films. It's up there, and I hope that you enjoy those. I was born in 1984. I was 1 year old, Christmas of 1985, the year Teddy Ruxpin, the world's first animated talking toy, debuted. I'm the first generation of kids who grew up with Teddy Ruxpin, and I loved the stories. I only had a handful of storybooks and cassettes for my Teddy Ruxpin. I still have my Teddy Ruxpin. Between the storybooks with the talking toy, the 1985 live action special, and the late 80s 65-episode animated series, The Adventures of Teddy Ruxpin, along with Thundercats, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the Smurfs, right, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teddy was a cornerstone of my childhood. I think it was in 2016, my then girlfriend, now my wife, I offhand mentioned, something about Teddy Ruxpin, and she said, I think I know what you're talking about. My wife was born and raised in Ecuador, and so I showed her the first episode, and she said, oh my goodness, I know what this is. I've never heard it in English though. And I said, well, I have all 65 episodes on DVD. She says, can we watch it? And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna marry you one day. So in August, we just binged. We just watched all 65 episodes, and afterwards, I'm thinking, I don't know anything about Ken Forsse. It's created by Ken Forsse. And so I looked online, and one of the first Teddy Ruxpin fan sites, there is a Ken Forsse interview. I think it was 1998, 1999, and I had remembered this, having read this as a kid. It's a great way to get into the window that is Ken's life, but you read this and you're like, there's hints of so much more. This was, again, 2016. Ken had passed away 2 years before this, and I started, just Googling, and I found the name of his widow, Jan Forsse. So in September, I sent a message, just, who I was, what I was thinking of doing, maybe, some sort of, look at Ken's life. I didn't hear anything about it after that. About a year later, I get this message, and it's Jan, and she says, we should talk. Oh my God. February of 2018, New York City, Jacob Javits Center, Toy Fair, I'm sitting there, across the table, it's Jan, and she says, I want you to do it. I'm sorry, what? She gave me the go-ahead to make this film on Ken Forsse, and at the time, all I knew was he had worked for the Disney company, spent some time with Sid and Marty Krofft, and Teddy Ruxpin comes out in 1985. That's all I have. I don't think I was fully prepared to learn everything that I have learned. It's really cool. To begin the process of research on this documentary, I knew I needed to interview, obviously, Jan. I needed to interview Ken's daughter, Teresa. I had to get a hold of Phil Barron, the one and only voice of Teddy Ruxpin, and a few other people who were involved with Alchemy 2 Incorporated in the 1980s and beyond, like Mary Becker and Linda Pearson. I went out to California in October of 2018 to begin the actual research process, and that's when I got, the contact information for Mary, and between her, between Jan, suddenly all these names and contact information starts flooding in, not just Phil and Michelle Barron, but Len Levitt, Art and Ashley, Tom Fountain. It just was overwhelming at one point, and then I'm realizing, okay, so it's not just going to be a handful of interviews, there's a lot of people involved here. You ask questions and you start getting bits of information, and you start getting this name and that name, and you have to start, have to start Googling, and you have to start researching. And over the course of 2019, between the interviews, searching documents that I found thanks to Jan, everything starts getting put into place. There are some gaps still, but suddenly in the later part of last year, the gaps start getting filled, not just with information, but visually as well. It goes hand in hand. Without the interviews, I couldn't have made sense of visuals that I was finding, and without the visuals, the interviews would not be specific enough for an audience to look at. So there's a combination of many things, especially when you're making a documentary. I had to find the contact information, we had to reach out, I have to make contact with the person and build a rapport, because I'm asking people to open up to me, let me into their lives and let me hear their stories, experience their memories with them. The person who was hardest to find and get a hold of was Will Ryan, the voice of Grubby and a million other characters in animation. And he ended up being the last of the interviews that I did in 2019. We did 40 altogether. Will was just wonderful. All those little gaps, filled them up so perfectly. He was pretty fantastic. He really was. He did the voice of Willie the Giant for me from Mickey's Christmas Carol. So like the inner child was going, yay! Of all the interviews that I was able to do, I can't say there was one specific favorite. The top of my list, just based on stories they were able to tell me and the value that those words brought. And it's a combination of Jan herself, Ken's daughter Teresa, Mary Becker, Linda Pearson, and Phil Barron. It was those five that really made it. Jan, because she was married to Ken, she was close to Ken for, they were together over 2 decades. Linda and Mary were 2 of Ken's original alchemists. They were there in the garage, October of 1982. And then of course, Teresa, Ken's daughter, she was the one Ken would tell what became the adventures of Teddy Ruxpin to. They were bedtime stories. If you can entertain a child with bedtime stories like that, then you've got gold, right? And then of course Phil, the one and only voice of Teddy Ruxpin. If you don't include Phil Barron in a documentary on Ken Forsse and his greatest creation, Teddy Ruxpin, you weren't trying. They all brought something different, but at the same time, what they shared was this love and admiration for Ken. The interview that surprised me the most was Tom Fountain. He's an amazing puppeteer. He was the puppeteer for Salem, the cat on Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the sitcom in the 90s with Melissa Joan Hart. When Mary Becker gave me Tom's contact information, in my head it's like, okay, he was a puppeteer, he consulted with Alchemy in the 80s. You don't realize that the talking toy, it's not just a matter of, typing ones and zeros into a keyboard, right? To do this, you need an experienced puppeteer. And Tom was brought in when the business started booming and they needed to do more stories. He's brought in, and he's probably the one who did the most programs, especially the foreign languages. He worked with Alchemy well into the 90s. And Tom's telling me, oh, there's a science behind it, and it's more than just doing this. You see the talking heads doing this, but you've got a little toggle switch here, a little joystick, and you've got to make it work. And what happens when Grubby in the one story eats a shush bush? What do you do with Grubby when the two of them are connected and telling the story? And it's wonderful because it's like you gotta do something with his eyes. Like he wants to talk, but he can't talk. And then it turns out Tom had been working for Sid and Marty Krofft at the same time that Ken was. They had not met one another. Ken's working on stuff for the Krofft theme park in Atlanta for the 1976 opening and unfortunate closing, but Tom's down there too working. And so you're getting this story a decade before he even knows what Teddy Ruxpin is. So he was a big surprise and a well-welcomed surprise as an interview. There are two elements to Ken's story that I think are really eye-opening and surprising. The first one is relative to Teddy Ruxpin. The average person, when they hear Teddy Ruxpin, they think of the 1980s, the talking toy debuts, and the rest is history, right? People don't realize the idea that became Teddy Ruxpin started in 1959. It takes almost it's like 20 years, over 20 years. He's working on it in the 60s, in the 70s, before ultimately you get a talking toy, because it wasn't always a talking toy. It's not a surprise to the fandom, but to the average person to know that Teddy Ruxpin was born in the mind of Ken Forsse in the late 50s. It's really important to know. Things don't happen overnight. The big surprise, without ruining anything, Ken, while he was working in the 1960s as a Disney Imagineer, he was also doing work for Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk, which is still there. It's an award-winning amusement park. There are some things that Ken created for them in 1966 that are still there today. And there's a few things that he proposed that never got beyond the planning stage, and we have that too, so stay tuned. Of the 40 interviews that I did, only 3 of them are on camera because everybody was scattered across the country. And this is an independent film. I'm financing it myself, so I had to come up with a podcast style interview. And so 37 people are just audio only. You might be wondering as you hear me say this, well, what are we going to look at? It's going to be a combination of original artwork produced by my wonderful artist, Najee R. Smith, the visuals that I've been able to accumulate, close to 2,000 just still images, several hours of old video footage. The way I went about accumulating this was, of course, working hand in hand with Ken Forsse out in California. We did 2 trips out there to start and finish the research process. 2 people need to also be thanked in addition to Jan as far as visuals go. Ken's daughter Teresa came through huge, and Linda Pearson. Linda alone is responsible for 677 individual photos. Thank you, Jan, Teresa, and Linda. You came through big time. At the end of 2019, I went on social media and I declared principal research was complete. 40 interviews, couple thousand images, few hours of archival footage from old VHS tapes and film. What do you do with it now? I have one of my production assistants, Natasha Lima, transcribing all 40 interviews. She doesn't like me very much, but she does a hell of a job doing it. I have to take 40 different interviews. The average interview is an hour and a half to 2 hours. Hours, not minutes, hours. I have to have the transcripts in front of me, and I have to, on paper or on the computer screen, create a coherent narrative. It's Ken's birth in 1936 to his, his unfortunate passing in 2014. You have to put a story together with the words. Will everything all 40 people said be heard? Absolutely not. Will all 40 people be heard at least once? Absolutely. No one's voice is being left out. It's a process, and that's why we're shooting for September 2021 on the anniversary of what would have been Ken's birthday. If it's ready before then, I will release it before then, but I want this ready by September 2021 at the latest. You take the interviews, I create a narration, and then we start mixing it all together, and then what visuals do I have that match what's being said, and then what I don't have, Najee, my artist, will recreate with original artwork. As far as music goes, you will hear a few of the Teddy songs, not in their entirety, of course. You'll hear a few of the Talking Mother Goose pieces, Branson Bear as well, but only enough to give you context so that you understand what the interviews and myself as narrator are talking about. The original musical score that will be featured is by Will Lewis, who is an amazing composer. I joke with him that he is the only person who will ever do the music to my my documentaries. Will's been listening to more music by George Wilkins, the wonderful composer of Teddy Ruxpin, Mother Goose, and Branson Bear than he ever thought he would listen to, and he's going to give you that kind of score that is reminiscent of what George was able to do, but something very much of Will's own mind. If I could sum up this entire process so far with one word: grateful. I am grateful that I have been given the opportunity to tell Ken Forsse's life story. Millions of kids around the world owned a Teddy Ruxpin. Millions more watched the animated series. I'm one person. I'm one person who got the opportunity to be let into the process that went into creating one of the most fantastic and successful toys. Stories, right? I'm grateful for that opportunity that Jan, Teresa, Mary, Linda, and Phil, and everybody else, I'm grateful for what for the opportunity that they've given me to tell the story. When you say the name Walt Disney, got it. Walt Disney, come on, Mickey Mouse. When you say Jim Henson, Kermit the Frog, the Muppets. When you say Ken Forsse, unfortunately, it doesn't mean a lot to the average person. And that breaks my heart, because Teddy Ruxpin, his name is there in the books, in the animated series, in the 1985 live-action special. If I didn't have the information that I have, I would feel a lot of pressure. But I'm going to be able to tell the most honest version of Ken's creative life. And I hope that his name is finally, up there on the list of great 20th century inventors, creators, storytellers. I mean, ultimately, that's what Walt Disney, Jim Henson, and Ken Forsse all have in common. They knew their limits, but the one thing they all had in common: master storytellers. It's such a loaded and complicated question. Why did Teddy Ruxpin just skyrocket to, stardom in 1985 when the talking toy debuted? It's not unlike the original Star Wars. If you release it a little earlier than 1977, the world wasn't ready. You release it a little later, and now it's still, you need that Goldilocks moment, right? It's just right. You had Disneyland out in California doing its thing. Walt Disney World in Florida had 2 parks now with the opening of Epcot. In the original exposure for the toy, they were like, what the audio animatronics that you love so much seeing at Walt Disney World and Disneyland, you can have at home now. Consumer level technology was growing at such a rate, people could barely keep up. And so here comes this talking plush. No one had ever seen anything like it. toys before that, talking toys, the drawstring, right? Like Sheriff Woody in Pixar's Toy Story. You also had toys where you squeeze and maybe they sang a song or a tune came out. Teddy didn't just make noise. Teddy blinked. Teddy spoke. There's a lot of talking toys. Once Teddy comes out, you have all these other talking toys debuting and talking toys since. It's not just the novelty of the talking toy. The idea of a toy talking, that was what got people's attention. It was the quality of the stories that kept interest, that kept people going back for more, because there were over 40 different storybooks. Without really good stories, I don't think I'm sitting here talking about it. I want to take the chance to talk directly to the world of Teddy Ruxpin fandom. I was sort of an outsider to it. I loved Teddy. You know, I've always loved Teddy, but I wasn't involved directly with you. And part of me regrets that, because now that I've met some of you, interacted with some of you on social media, I realize that I wasn't alone in my love for Teddy and all of his stories. And I think what has surprised me the most is that I have met fans my age, a little older, a little younger, and I'm discovering that there are fans who are still children. You know, I think that's wonderful. And I just want to let you know, it doesn't matter if you love the talking toy from '85, the short-lived Play School one in the early '90s, Yes Entertainment in the late '90s, Backpack Toys in the mid-2000s, or even this new one, Wicked Cool Toys as Teddy. If that's what you love, fantastic. If you love the live-action special from 1985 and that's your Teddy, and if you're like me and you're a nut over the animated series, if you love all of it, if you love some of it, it's fine. You have kept Teddy Ruxpin alive, every single one of you. Without you, I don't think I'm as motivated. Keep sending questions, keep following, keep in touch. This documentary is for you, it's for the people behind Teddy Ruxpin, it's for the memory and legacy of Ken Forsse, and it's for me rediscovering that cornerstone of my childhood.